starting to talk about the regulatory reporting interface. And as I talk about this, once again, we're in a situation where regulators and operators are being impacted. And they're being impacted by the system purchasing decisions that they made, and obviously by the proprietary APIs that those systems use. Now, as we've discussed, this impact is, obviously more pronounced in the land-based side of the industry, but let me tell you, the online side also has its issues. So let me paint a bit of a picture by providing some background information, right? Um, so let's start with land based. So in the land based sector, there are four major suppliers of the large enterprise level casino management systems. You know them. They're Aristocrat, IGT, Konami, and Scientific Games. There are a number of other smaller companies that provide systems for smaller casinos and parlors. But for the sake of this discussion, I'm just going to focus on the big ones because I think it's good enough. Now, each one of those CMSs work differently, and they obviously have different databases. While the information they collect is the same, because, well, there's the same table games, there are the same slot machines providing the same information, the names that they give each of the pieces of data, or as I like to call them, data elements, is different. Not only are the names of the data elements different, but they also define the data elements type differently, and those data elements might have different attributes. So, for example, what do I mean? Well, the length of a data element might be different from CMS to CMS. So, let's say, given name. My name is Mark. The length that field or the data element might have in a CMS by Scientific Games might be different than the length it has from a CMS developed by Aristocrat. There are many jurisdictions or countries in the world where people have two or three names. So you need to be able to accommodate those many names. Um, and as I mentioned, the type of data element might be different. In some CMSs, it could be a string. In some CMSs, it could be a text. And as you know, that's slightly different. So what this means is that as the reports that the regulators get from the operators using those different systems are going to be, well, different. And now this puts a burden on the regulators who have to figure out how to compile this information so that they can generate the reports that they need to share with other governmental agencies and the reports that they themselves have to consume. Now, don't, as I mentioned, don't think this is just a land-based problem. In the online gaming sector, there are more than a dozen internet gaming platform providers. And as you recall, the IGP is sort of the equivalent to the CMS in the land-based side. They also use different technologies. They also use different databases. And yes, they define data elements differently. So regulators trying to deal with online reporting also face the same disparity issues. Now, what's really interesting is that out of self-defense, I guess, the regulators often go to the casino management system and internet gaming platform suppliers and say, look, you need to change how you provide information to me in order for you to be approved to be used in my jurisdiction. This is now a regulatory requirement. And obviously, these requirements are going to be unique by jurisdiction. So now think about, a system supplier that is licensed in multiple jurisdictions. And I've been spending a lot of time in Europe, obviously, and working with a lot of different European countries and a lot of European regulators. And you've got suppliers that are licensed in 12 different countries, each one having a very different reporting requirement. Even though it's the same IGP, it's the same CMS, it's the same games, the reporting requirements are very different. So what happens? The suppliers don't have a choice. They have to create these one-off reporting modules in order to meet the regulatory requirements. And then when the regulators change their mind, or when they decide, they need different information, or the report's formatted different or different frequency, what happens? Well, the suppliers have to once again spend money on things that don't make them money, which are these very, low level brick and mortar, blocking and tackling sort of, functionality. Clearly, this situation was very ripe for standardization. And that's where RRI comes in. So there are a number of benefits that RRI provides. And by the way, it is always beneficial whenever a standard is being created, that it actually provides a win-win for both the industry and the policy domains. And in this case, it absolutely does that. So the suppliers and the operators are on the industry side. Obviously, the regulators are on the policy side. So let's start with the suppliers. For them, it creates a single reporting mechanism that eliminates the need to create those one-off reporting modules per jurisdiction. It therefore obviously reduces the effort required to provide their software. It doesn't matter whether this is a CMS or an IGP or a lottery system. They can get their application, their platform, into a jurisdiction faster and cheaper because they already comply with all of the reporting requirements. For regulators, especially regulators that are responsible for providing oversight to all three gaming verticals, land based, online, and lottery, it provides a single standardized data feed, and it frees them up to use off the shelf tools to consume the data. There are analytical applications like Tableau, for example, that they can use to slice and dice and analyze this data because now it is standardized. They don't have to massage it anymore. And it allows the regulators to be able to compare information with other jurisdictions on an apples to apples basis if they so choose. Ultimately, for operators, it eliminates the need for them to potentially have to develop custom reporting solutions if the suppliers don't want to. It lowers compliance costs because, well, it's definitely going to comply with anything that the regulators want, and I'll explain the flexibility and the extensibility that has been designed into RRI shortly, and it obviously reduce the time to get into a new market. So, what is RRI? Well, first and foremost, um, when you're creating a standard, and especially creating a standard that is going to be reporting data, the first thing you need to do is to understand what is this data that's being reported and what is required. How should it be formatted? How frequently is it required? How should it be sent? How will it be secured? And ultimately, how is it going to be stored? And then how and who is going to consume it? So when we set out to create RRI, which again supports land-based, online, and lottery gaming, we had to create. We wanted to make sure we had one reporting standard that worked across all of them. So we started with the first question: what is it? Or more importantly, what data do we need to send to the regulators? And to answer that question, we first needed to take a look at the data the regulators are asking for and why. And then the data generated by the gaming activities that are provided. Because in some cases, the regulators were not asking for some data because they either did not know it existed or they thought they could not get it. So they were actually being hampered in their ability to provide oversight because they were not even aware that they could get certain pieces of information. So, as we were going through this exercise, it led us to create what we call a data dictionary. And this data dictionary is broken down by the type of data element that is being collected and reported. And then what we did for each one of these data elements is we defined them. Um, and and let me tell you that at the end of this exercise, we came up with three different data element types, and then a number of enumerations or selectable values within some of those data elements. So the other thing sorry, that we did with RRI is that we decided to use XML, and we decided to use XML because it is a very commonly used computer language. Everybody that or I shouldn't say everybody, but most computer industry people and most computer systems know how to handle XML. And we also created an XML schema definition so that this is a well-defined protocol with a well-defined schema. We also, as we were going through and defining these data elements, did our best to use as many existing standards as we could. Standards like ISO and RFC. And we did that again because there are plenty of computer systems out there that are already used to using ISO and RFC and ITU and other types of standards. So, um, sorry, was there a question? No. Okay. So the data element types that we ended up coming up with were three: attributes, common data types, and then metrics. Now, attributes are data elements that can be comprised of either a single simple data type or a single complex data type. The common data types are those that are either simple or complex data types. And a simple data type, as its name implies, is used to describe a single piece of information, whereas a complex data type is actually made up of one or more simple data types, or it could even be comprised of other complex data types. And then we have the metrics. And metrics are data elements that are used to report statistical information. I'm going to give you an example of all of these data element types in a moment. The other thing that we did with RRI is that we designed it intentionally to be extensible and flexible. We knew that there was no way that innovation was not going to continue to occur within our industry. And we knew that we had to have a standard that could grow to support new game types, new data elements, new defined enumerations. And we also knew that even though we did our best to capture the needs of all the regulatory authorities worldwide, that's a huge undertaking. So, we weren't sort of fooling ourselves that we got it all right from day one. We wanted to make sure that jurisdictions could add their own data elements, their own attributes, as well as their own enumerations. So we did that by putting together some rules. So enumerations can be added, but they have to have a unique 3-character prefix. And I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. Attributes and subelements can also be added, but they have to be added using a unique namespace. So the XSD that is being created using these new attributes and subelements has to have a unique namespace. And the namespace does not have to be for the entire XSD. It can actually be for sections, because the other thing that we did is we broke down RRI into reporting categories. Because quite frankly, maybe a jurisdiction does not have sports. Maybe they only do land-based and online gaming, or a jurisdiction might only have land-based and lottery and no online. So they don't need to implement the whole RRI protocol. So we built that flexibility in there. And then, of course, the other rule that we put in place is that the XML namespaces have to be constructed using a standard and that standard is uniform resource names. And the components of that namespace are what you see in front of you on the screen. It has to have a URN, it has to have a domain, it has to have a protocol, a version, the author, and the section of the protocol or the extension for which this particular namespace is designed to work with or is associated with. Each one of those components is separated by a colon, and that becomes the namespace. The other thing that we did was we made sure that we supported three different reporting frequencies: real time, near real time, and periodic. Real time reporting really is intended to be used with a very limited number of transactions. Really, the transactions where regulators want to have full control or to accept or deny the transaction as it is going to occur. There are in the online space, for example, there's only one jurisdiction in the world that is currently using a real-time system, and that happens to be Italy. Near real-time reporting is intended to be used when you want a higher level of transactional detail, but not to the same level as real time. So in this reporting model, the data is reported after the activity has been completed, but again, at a higher frequency. So for example, every 15 minutes, every hour, not like periodic, where periodic data is summary data and is reported typically at the end of a day, at the end of a week or a month or some other period. Regardless, we built these reporting frequencies into RRI. The other thing that we did was we ensured um, that the reporting frequencies tied to each other from an accounting perspective. So if you run a bunch of real time reports and then you run a near real time report for a period, if you sum up the real time reports for that same period, it would match the near real time report. And if you took a bunch of near real time reports and you summed them up for a period, they would match the same periodic report for that period. So there is numeric and accounting integrity in how these reports are built. And that was very important because in some instances, regulators might want some aspect of near real time reporting, but really what they're going to be looking at the end of the month is those periodic reports, and they want to make sure obviously that the two types of reports foot or they match each other. Now, we are talking about gaming, we are talking about money. And I'm sorry that that graphic is not very clear. I do apologize. I'll talk through it briefly. So RRI has an accounting model, and the accounting model is very similar to a double entry accounting model. And what that means is that for every debit, which is a deduction, there is a corresponding credit or addition. The only exception to that is when the deduction is happening outside of the gaming ecosystem, or the opposite, when the addition, the credit, is outside the ecosystem. And that happens when, for example, a player moves money from their banking account into an online player wallet, or they take money from a banking account and they deposit it into a CMS account. So the debit obviously is happening at the bank outside of the gaming ecosystem, and the corresponding credit is happening in the CMS or in their player wallet, which is inside the ecosystem. Those are the only ones that are unmatched. All the other ones are all paired. So if a player wagers money from their wallet, there is a debit to their wallet and there is a credit to the game. Then the game plays. If they win, then there is a credit to the player wallet and there's a debit to the game. If the game pays a fee because it is maybe a premium game, and the supplier gets a portion of the wagers placed on it. The game is debited the amount of that fee, and the payment goes as a credit to the third party. Likewise, if the games are participating in a progressive jackpot, a portion of the game's coin in is debited and it goes as a credit into the jackpot. And of course, when the jackpot is hit, well, then it's a debit to the jackpot and a credit to the game. And ultimately, as I mentioned, all of this ends up either as a debit or a credit to those external sources like banks. So that's how the accounting model works within RRI. Very clean, very easy, very similar to how normal accounting works. Now let's talk about the different data elements and the different data element attributes. Um, so the first type of data element that we created are these common sorry are attributes, and these attributes are comprised of either simple or complex data types. And I'm just giving you some examples here of what the element looks like and how we've defined them. And as I mentioned, these data elements are not only defined from an English perspective what they are, but they're also defined in terms of whether they are required or optional, what default values they have, and in some cases, the pattern, in other words, the character sets that they can be comprised of, in addition to the length. So you see here the address type. It is comprised of the attribute. Sorry, it's comprised of the simple type T address type. It is a required use, and it is defined as the type of address. For example, home or work, and that type of address, home or work, is actually an enumeration, and I'll show you how those work momentarily. Anti amount is another attribute or element, and it is comprised of the T underscore money simple data type. It is an optional use, and the default value is zero. Now it's optional because not in poker there might be situations where there is no anti amount at this point in time that the information is being reported. And as you can see, it is defined as the anti amount placed by the player. Birth date, the same is self-explanatory. It is T underscore date. And again, the use is optional. Now you might say, why is birth date optional? Don't you need to know the age of the player? One of the things that we did in RRI is to make as many of the data elements optional as possible. And we did that because we wanted to give flexibility to the regulators in the jurisdiction to determine which data elements they absolutely wanted and which ones they did not. Because actually, in some jurisdictions, there are some data elements that are in RRI that the regulators themselves are not allowed by law to collect. So we wanted to make sure that we did not inadvertently make one of those data elements required, because then RRI would not be usable in that jurisdiction. Notice that birth date uses ISO 20022. As I mentioned, to the largest extent possible, we tried to use already existing standards within RRI. Controller type is another element. It uses the T underscore controller type simple type, and it is the type of jackpot controller, for example, a standard jackpot controller, a mystery, or a hybrid. Simple data types, which are part of the common data types, all start with a T underscore prefix, as you saw in the prior slide. Um, these data types are defined, as I mentioned, in terms of the type of data that they're comprised of and their length or patterns. And what you see here is a data type called T underscore description, which is used extensively throughout the standard. It is an excess string, and it has a maximum length of 128 characters. You see T underscore currency code, also a string. However, in this case, its maximum length is only 3 characters. And the currency code must conform to ISO 4217. So, for example, the 3 character code for US dollars is USD. T underscore ITU number is also a string, but it has a pattern. And that pattern is one that allows us to create a phone number that conforms to the ITU WTNG conventions. And then T underscore time uses the construct excess time, and this time must comply with the partial time format that is specified in RFC 3339. 3339 is time and date. In this case, we're only using the time portion, so that's why we are conforming only to the time aspect of RFC 3339. Now, these are just a few of the data types that I'm showing you. RRI has hundreds of these elements, the attributes, the simple data types, complex data types, and enumeration. So this was quite the undertaking to create this data dictionary. The next component or building block of RRI are the complex data types. Um, and as I mentioned, these are comprised either of simple data types or even of other complex types. And all of the complex types start with a C underscore prefix. In this case, I'm showing you some of the components that go into C underscore player. And that data type is actually comprised of 3 attributes: jurisdiction code, operator ID, and player ID. And you can see that some of them are optional, but player ID is required. Now, the reason jurisdictional code is optional is that not every jurisdiction actually assigns itself a jurisdiction code. Some do and some don't, so we made it optional. In some cases, the regulators don't care which operator a particular player information is being reported on, so we made that optional as well. But obviously, you need to know who the player is. Otherwise, what's the sense of having a report talking about player activity? And that's why the player identifier is required. I'll give you another example of a complex data type. This is getting into more detail about a player and is called C underscore player info. And here we have information such as given names, family names, nationality, residence, and there's a whole bunch of other attributes that comprise C underscore player info. Now you might be wondering, why does it say given names and family names? Well, that's because in countries like Spain, the number of given names and the number of family names is more than one. And if you don't include them all, then you might be talking about a completely different person. So RRI has the ability to allow the capture of multiple first and middle names in the given name, separated by a comma, and the same thing for family names. They're all separated by commas. And let me give you an example of metrics. And metrics are an interesting set of elements because they are comprised of common data types, but they're used in data reports that are typically dealing with tournaments, party mutual wagering, fantasy, and bingo. They're also used to report statistical information, which is why they're called metrics. They're not really designed to provide specific data like a player name or ante amount or um, games uh, games wagered or something like that. They really are designed for statistical purposes. And what you see here are 3 of them. One is player count, one is games played count, and one is stake amount. Um, and again, these are statistical information. Stake amount, for those of you not familiar with perhaps poker, is very different than wagered amount and different than ante amount. A stake amount is the amount of money a player transfers onto a table. However, even if that player transfers, let's say, $1,000 onto a table, it doesn't mean that they even wager any of it. They might never play. So their ante amount would be zero, and their wagered amount would be zero. So stake amount is in essence their personal bank, what they bought in terms of chips with, and then as they start to place anti bets and then regular wagers, those get captured in those data elements, and the stake amount, is again that initial buy-in amount. And finally, let me talk a little bit about enumerations. And as I mentioned, enumerations are like the values you might find in a drop down list when you're dealing with, a Windows based form, for example. In this case, the enumerations have to do with this data element called T address type. As I mentioned before, the values are home, business, and now, we expand them on PO box, delivery, mail to, and other. Notice that each of the enumerations start with a unique three-letter prefix, RRI. So this is what I said initially when I mentioned that RRI is extensible. So anybody could create their own enumerations, but let's say that the Macau regulators wanted to use RRI, but they wanted to create their own enumerations, they would have to come up with a three-letter prefix that is unique to identify their added enumerations from the standard RRI ones and from any other enumerations that others might create in the future within the standard. Any questions on RRI? I went through that rather quickly this time. I had too much coffee today, so I'm talking a little faster than I usually do. Any questions? All right, seeing none, let me now do a little deeper dive on the reporting categories. So, as I mentioned, RRI was designed to allow regulators to pick and choose what they needed to use. And while we're calling these reports, don't think of these as reports in terms of rows and columns with formatting and date and time and all the stuff. This is not really a report. It's a data file being reported from the systems to the regulatory system. So from the operational systems to the regulatory system. And so what we did was we created data reporting categories to give the regulators more flexibility to pick and choose which of these components made sense for them. So the first reporting category is about jackpots. And this is reporting on jackpot controllers and the money movements that have to do with progressive jackpots or mystery jackpots within the land based online and lottery world. And then we've got an online game reporting category, which obviously is all about online games, but we broke them down by the different types of online games. So you've got online casino games. These would be, slots and maybe some blackjack and other types of casino games. We've got casino tournaments. We've got fixed odds betting, betting exchanges, pari mutual, and then we've got poker cash games, which are different than poker tournaments. We've got fantasy games. We have bingo games, and finally we've got numbers games. And numbers games are the lottery component. So you've got lotto and traditional lottery and electronic scratch offs. All those are part of the online numbers games. The next category is land based. And for land based, we again broke it down by game category. So we've got table games, gaming machines, and gaming machines includes slot machines, VLTs, electronic table games because they're really slot machines. So any type of gaming device falls under gaming machines. Again, we've got fixed odds betting, we've got the bingo games, numbers games, we've got tournaments, and of course, pari mutual. And then we've got a number of miscellaneous reports, and this is where those metrics data elements come in, because we've got metrics reports, splits reports, and exchange rate reports. And let me talk a little bit about splits because this one is interesting. So, one of the things that happens in online that does not really happen in land based, although in theory it could, is that in online, there is such a thing as funds in play. And funds in play are monies that are still in the process of being wagered when a reporting period ends. So let's say that you're playing a poker game and you just wagered, a bunch of money on a particular hand, and the end of the day happens. Well, the online systems have to report the activity as of that point in time. So that wager is actually funds in play. I'll give you another example. As we discussed 2 days ago when we were going through the online gaming systems and how they work, with wallets, sometimes a portion of the player's wallet is taken from the IGP or from the e wallet provider, and it is transferred to the game service provider where the games are being played. So the wallet has been debited, the game service provider and it has been credited, so the money is there, and the end of day period occurs. So at that point, the monies that are no longer in the player's wallet, but they are monies that have not yet been wagered, so they are in the process, are reported as funds in play. So the splits reports actually allows regulators to get information on exactly where the player's money is and what type of games have these funds in play. So they can generate these reports from a player perspective. How much money do players have spread out across different GSPs, or how much money do they have invested in poker tournaments where those tournaments have not yet ended. Or they can do it from the game perspective, and that is, which game categories have funds in play attributed to them, and how much are they, and when do we expect those funds in play to actually be either wagered or returned to the player. So that splits report is actually interesting, and it is one that many jurisdictions really need in order to truly provide oversight in terms of money movement. So I'm going to now transition into a standard that I personally have been helping the European Commission and the European Committee for Standardization create. Obviously, this is, excuse me, a European standard, um, and it is one that is quite interesting and has been a quite a bit of work for the past couple of years. Um, so I don't know if many of you have a good understanding of how the European Union works and how the European Commission works within the European Union, and how those various different member states work together, except that we all know that the United Kingdom is Brexiting. They're leaving the European Union, and that's big news because, well, they're getting a divorce and all of the stuff that is reported in the news, and it is actually big news. But the European Commission really acts as a sort of centralized governmental body overseeing all of the activities of the various EU member states. And it is not actually accurate to just say European Union member states, because within the European community there are also European Economic Area states that are not part of the European Union per se, but are also governed by the European Commission because they are allowed to conduct trading activity with the European Union member states. And by the way, when I say a member state, I mean countries. So France, Italy, Spain, Malta, Cyprus, Slovenia, Slovakia. I mean, all of the various member states. So what happened is that several years ago, the European Commission asked its then expert group on gambling to research whether standardizing reporting for gambling activities would be beneficial for regulatory authorities. The expert group is something that the European Commission has for every major industry in Europe. It is usually comprised of regulatory authorities or of organizations designed to provide oversight for that specific industry, and they are from all of the different member states. So these are groups that are standing groups within the EC. And for example, if the European Commission wanted to say, hey, does it make sense for us to standardize the size of tires on cars so that you don't have to worry about having different size tires on cars? Would that make sense? No more, 19-inch tires and 18-inch tires and 17-inch tires. There's only one tire size, period, for all kinds of cars. They would go to the expert group in the automotive industry and say, "Hey, guys, can you go do some research on this and tell us whether this makes any sense or not?" So the expert group on gambling went out and they spent about 2 years doing a study. And as is usually the case within Europe, they do this through consultations with various stakeholders in the different countries. And, it takes time to set up these meetings, to get information, to follow up, and to finally compile it all, which is why it took them, a couple of years. Um, at the end of this 2 year period, the expert group went back to the EC and said, yes, yes, it makes absolute sense to standardize reporting because, it's a mess out there. We've got different regulators asking for different stuff. We've got suppliers complaining that, regulators are changing the reporting requirements, frequently. It's costing them money. It's costing them issues. We've got operators that are complaining that they can't get the platforms that they want because they don't have the right reporting requirements. And yes, it would be great to be able to compare data across member states and for the European Commission to get visibility to what's happening in the online gambling world within Europe. So yes, we should do this. And the European Committee said, the Commission said, great. Then we are going to ask for this work to be done, and the European Committee for Standardization, or CEN for short, took on the task of creating the standard. And to do that, they created a technical committee and they assigned numbers to the technical committees. So this happens to be Technical Committee 456. And that technical committee was going to do the work. Now, what's interesting is that while all this was going on, we within IGSA, having a number of members who are very much involved in the online space, we're told that we've got a problem that is very ripe for standardization. And the problem happens to be regulatory reporting. And as we started to dig into what this really meant, and as we started to talk to regulators, in addition to the industry, the suppliers and the operators, it occurred to us that this problem actually existed not just in online, but in land based and lottery spaces as well. And it actually was a bigger problem for regulatory authorities that are responsible for providing oversight for all three of those verticals because the reports that they get are vastly different from each of those different, gaming verticals. So we decided early on that we should not focus just on online. We should really focus on all three verticals. Um, so we started to actually do this work, and in the 2 years it took for the EC expert group to come back and say, yes, we want a standard, we within IGSA had gotten up to draft 14, 1 4 of the RRI standard. So when we heard that the European Commission had created this technical committee and had mandated CEN to go do this, go create this reporting standard, we said, wait a second, we should participate in this because, well, we've been doing it, and why should we have two different standards? We should have one standard. So GSA Europe became a liaison organization to Technical Committee 456, and I was elected project leader of the technical work group to create the standard within Europe. Now, as I said, we didn't want to have two different standards. So, what IGSA did is we took draft 14 and we actually donated it to CEN because sometimes it's easier to have something in front of you and to edit it than to start from a blank piece of paper. And we knew that RRI had too much in it because it had lottery and land based, and the mandate from the EC was only for online. But we thought at least we've got something that we can work with, and at least we've got a hope that we can keep these two protocols aligned. And so that's what we did. And CEN was very grateful and they accepted our submission and we started working on the standard. What is going on with my computer? There we go. Now, 2 years later, we have a standard that has been completed. It has gone out for vote, and 31 different European countries voted on the standard, and we had only two dissenting votes. There were numerous comments that were submitted in this first formal review of the full standard. We just finished going through all those comments, and now there will be a second formal vote that will take place early next year. And we expect that the standard will be approved and it will become a pan European standard for regulatory reporting for the online gaming vertical. Now, I mentioned that we wanted to make sure that OGR and RRI were as close to each other as possible. And they are. In fact, we achieved our goal. There's only a few differences, and I'll go through them. Um, OGR uses elements, whereas RRI uses attributes. For those of you that are familiar with XML, the difference is really minor. With elements, you have to specify the minimum occurrence and the maximum occurrence for all of them. With attributes, you use things like required or optional, and you only use min awk or max awk in some specific cases. Very minor change. OGR is focused only on online gaming. Well, we knew that from the get go. RRI supports land based online and lottery. Okay, so OGR is a subset of RRI. Now, the OGR standard obviously has to meet the EU member state gaming needs, so it is very specific and limited in the functionality that it provides, whereas RRI, well, was designed to meet worldwide gaming needs, so it's much, much broader. Um, OGR also defines the commonly used European data elements. It doesn't define everything, and even and I use the word commonly on purpose because there are a number of European countries that use data elements that are actually not in OGR, and the reason for that is because we consider those data elements to be one-offs, and so we decided, look, OGR, just like RRI, is extensible. It is very flexible. It uses namespaces just like RRI. It does everything just like RRI. So if those European countries want to use those data elements that only they use, well, then they can add them to the specification. They can create their own namespace for the specific report that uses those data elements, and they're good to go, and they're still within the confines of the standard. Obviously, RRI defines a very, very broad set of data elements. And then the other, I'll call it, sort of major, although it isn't, difference is that OGR uses the recursive method for multiple entries, whereas RRI uses comma delimited method for multiple entries. So when I was talking earlier about uh, given names and family names, and I said in RRI you can list as many as you have, but they are comma delimited. In OGR, each one is a different entry within that same data element, but it's actually a different row if you want to think of it that way. Um, those really are the major differences between OGR and RRI. And as you can see, they're pretty minor.